And so one of the, I think, shocking factors of something like this is that you do find an inscriptional archaeological, and on the floor, it has this inscription, and it says, in honor of God, Jesus Christ.
So Wes Huff is at the Museum of the Bible, and he has proof that Christians always believe Jesus is God by one of the most amazing findings in archaeological history. So let's get right into it. Shout out to Wes Huff and Apologetic Canada.
Well, and let's talk about that, because this Megiddo Mosaic is said to be, outside of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the greatest archaeological discovery that we currently have. Which, I mean, that is a bold statement.
That's a very big statement.
And the reason that they're saying this is because this mosaic dates to around the year 230, and it has this high Christological statement on it. So, Wes, why don't you unpack that for us a bit? Like, what is being said here that's so significant?
Yeah, so it has the earliest inscription of Jesus being called God outside of the New Testament. So obviously within the New Testament, we have multiple statements like that in Philippians, all throughout the Gospels, of Jesus being described with either the honors, the attributes, the names, or the deeds of being Yahweh God. But in terms of some sort of like overt archaeological inscription or something, and in one way we shouldn't expect to see that. The Christians were this group. They weren't the ones necessarily building the palaces and inscribing things on walls. And so one of the, I think, shocking factors of something like this is that you do find an inscriptional archaeological writing on the floor, which is what this is, of a building, which is arguably, I mean, I think this is being described as the earliest church, coming from the 3rd century. Because if we think of a church,
would have been a place of worship.
A place of worship where this community would have come together and they would have celebrated. I mean, what's in the middle is a table. And Andy, you and I were talking about earlier, why is there a table in the middle? Well, I don't think it's a bold claim to say, well, hey, what do Christians do at a table? Well, they do something like, well, what do we call the sacrament? The Lord's table, right? So I think we can reasonably assume what would have been going on here in terms of the worship life of the community. And on the floor, it has this inscription given to this individual, a keptos, and it says, in honor of God, Jesus Christ. And so this is not just, a passing statement, especially in the society that would have seen and understood who the God and gods were. It's not a small statement to associate Jesus with something like that titled.
Yeah, and I want
That's so good, because you hear a lot of people claiming no one ever believed Jesus was God until like the Nicene Creed, until the 300s. You can see here early in the 2nd century that they're writing down Jesus is God. As far as we know, from the beginning of time in Christianity, they always believe Jesus is God in the divinity of Jesus.
unpack this a bit because it is so significant. First, this akeptos, it says, is a lover of God, which I find interesting, right?
That's
because
cool.
we see that a very similar phrase being used by Luke at the beginning of his gospel in chapter 1, verse 3, that he is, doing this work, writing this book for this Theophilus, right?
Yeah, both Luke, Acts.
Yeah.
So if the listeners don't know, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts is written by the same person, and it's like part 1, part 2. The church, part 1, the inception. The church, part 2, the ongoing ministry. And it's written to this, what seems to be an individual, Theophilus, right? God lover. It's often argued, though, that could have been a community. It could have been an individual who had commissioned this writing, which I think personally is the one that I'm most convinced of.
Yeah.
We see other writings from the ancient world in Greco-Roman antiquity where with these same sort of inscriptions, I'm writing to you most excellent, which indicates that he could have been a Roman individual of well financial means. And so
it's interesting that she has the same title,
Yes.
right? That she's a God lover, and it's interesting that it's a female.
Yeah,
Right.
and that other females are mentioned.
Yeah, a group.
So we should mention that the floor has a number of inscriptions. It has this particular inscription with this title giving God and Jesus the same sort of connective tissue. It also has an inscription that names a number of women who are involved in this community. And then on the opposite side, it mentions a Roman centurion who paid by his own financial means for this to be done.
That's
And so
cool.
you have this very interesting mixing of gender and social status, which also kind of breaks the norms of what would have been going on within society.
And if that wasn't enough, of course, the mosaic gets its name because it was found in Megiddo, but it was found in a garrison, a Roman garrison. So this would have been, where Roman soldiers would have been.
Hmm.
And this would have been a place of worship there. I mean, that's fascinating. Year 230, and you got Romans worshiping Jesus as God, or Gentiles, right? Like that this was a part of their tradition at that time, or they had that freedom, if you will.
And a period of time where Christianity, in different pockets, was being persecuted across the Roman Empire. And remember that Christianity wasn't decriminalized as a public religion that could be practiced outside of the oversight of the Roman Empire until 313 with Constantine at the Peace of the
Wow.
Church. So until that particular proclamation, it wasn't easy to be a Christian.
But I think you'd agree, though, at around 230, though.
Yes, and this is a very bold statement for that early on. I mean, just to say God, Jesus Christ, putting the two together. I mean, you don't really always see statements of that, that concrete in a way this early. Now, you definitely have people like Origen of Alexandria who would be around the same time, right? He is talking about the eternal generation of the Son. So you're definitely getting those conversations, and he's a very big deal and a very big influence. So that language is certainly going to be in the culture. But again, he's a bit of a subordinationist still. This is way before the Council of Nicaea, okay? So before
It's
those
100 years
affirmations.
before the
Exactly.
Council of Nicaea,
And,
which is significant.
significant there. Then you also have people like Tertullian would be around the same time as well. He's formulating, giving us the language of the Trinity, which we will later adopt. But to really see in actual practice among Gentiles, among actual people who are worshiping Jesus Christ, to see this statement, Jesus is God. That's just, it adds and reinforces, I think, this idea of an early Christological development.
That's amazing. That makes me so happy and excited. I know we covered this before, but it's super interesting for them to talk about it because we love Wes Huff and all the work that he's doing. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. And yeah, that is very interesting that they were still writing in inscription, Jesus is God, at a building, but still probably were facing some persecution still. It wasn't legal to worship Jesus until the 3rd century.
That they're all focused on.
Yeah, and there's a particular feature in the inscription that is worth noting, in that when you look at, say, something like early biblical manuscripts, there's this scribal feature that is common called Noma Sakra.
Yeah, what does that mean?
So that's Latin for sacred names. And we're not 100% sure exactly why Christians start to produce these abbreviations, but what they start to do is they start to take either the first 2 letters and the last letter, or the first letter and the last letter of a word, like Jesus, Jesus, or Kurios, Lord, or Huios, Son.
Or God.
Or God, yeah, Theos. And they would then take, they would abbreviate it, they would squish it, say the first letter, the theta for theos, and the sigma at the end of the theos, theta, sigma, and then they would put a line over top. And we see this commonly all throughout the manuscripts of the New Testament. And even, Andy, when you and I were in Egypt a couple of summers ago and we looked at the Gospel of Thomas, we see the Gnostics adopting these things in their appropriation of early Christian literature. But it's once again, it's trying to copy what the early Christians are doing. And so we find that within the manuscript tradition. We've seen that in a number of manuscripts that we've looked at here at the Museum of the Bible. But to see it then written on a floor, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you're saying, that it's not just in a manuscript, but that we're even seeing it on a floor. And I got to ask, Wes, what are some ideas that people have for why they might do this?
Yeah, so there are some theories in terms of the abbreviation of maybe this is something analogous to when the Jews had these scribal practices of the sacred name of the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, Yahweh Vavhe, where we see traditions of them, say, leaving it in the Paleo-Hebrew. In fact, even in Greek manuscripts of the Greek translations of the Old Testament, sometime when they get to the divine name, they will stop writing it in Greek and they'll write it in Paleo-Hebrew and then continue on in Greek as sort of this reminder that there's something special going on about this name. Or the whole reason why we have the word Jehovah is because there was this practice that developed probably orally just prior to Jesus, but then when you get to, say, the Middle Ages and the Masoretic scribes, these Jewish traditional scribes, are developing these vowel pointing systems within the manuscripts, what they start to do is they take the consonants of Yahweh, Yahweh, Wahweh, and the vowels of Adonai, which is the Hebrew word for my Lord, and they squish them together. So the consonants of Yahweh, the vowels of Adonai gives you the word Yahweh, which is not a real word.
Yahweh.
It's not a Hebrew word. But the Jews would have seen that funny word, and it would have been a reminder, don't say this name out loud in order to, say, not commit blasphemy, not, say the Lord's name in vain. Yeah. And say instead Adonai. Read the vowels instead of the consonants. And so later on, when you get, in translation, particularly in the Germanic languages, they would take that Y, which becomes a J later on in German and English, and they would just write it out straight, Jehovah, instead of Yahweh. And that's where we get Jehovah. But this was never something a Jew would have said. This was something a Jew would have seen as like a visual reminder to not say the divine name out loud. And so there were these traditions that developed within ancient Judaism that around reverence towards divine things. And so one of the theories, which is highly debated, mind you, is that when we see something like the Noma Sakra, and we see Christians developing these scribal traditions around reverence for particular words, Jesus, Christ, God, Son, even cross and blood are in there sometimes. Is that kind of a carrying over of this Jewish tradition? Maybe. We're not entirely sure. There are some caveats to this.
I can
but
see that.
Either way, this is something that Christians start to do specifically that we don't see being done in, say, like Hellenistic classical literature for similar words.
I mean, you can still see in today's world a lot of, especially evangelical Christians, won't want to use God's name in vain. They don't want to just use it flippantly. And maybe that's what's going on here, because they still think Jesus, God, is something that you should hold to high regard. Could be a possibility.
It's interesting that even in the Mosaic, you get it in two ways. One is you have that line that's above it, but then we also see a dot on either side of God, Jesus, and Christ, which is, it would seem, we're not exactly sure why they're doing it.
Yeah,
but
it's conjectural, but they're sectioning this out as like a stylistic or artistic way of saying this is special.
What are your thoughts with regards to this high Christology that we're seeing this early on, right? Because people will often say, it's not until way later that the church kind of comes to this idea, or people start, inventing this idea that Jesus is God sort of idea.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between, the ways in which Christology develops and the way in which some people have imagined that sort of new information is being added. We were talking earlier about this idea of there were many messianic pretenders. Their movements all got squashed with the death of their Messiah. That's when it ended. Not with this one. Clearly something developed. And the idea that somehow a mythology can start around a human being, and we all know that there are examples of this. There can be attestations of legend or something like that that can get attached to people. But when you were talking about the claims of Jesus being God, that is a much greater claim than some of the things I think we often associate with legend. Name another place where that's happened. You don't see it. You take like the legend of Arthur, for instance. I mean, that developed over 500 years and all he got was a magical sword, right? This isn't the same thing. Clearly you see something developing that is already there, present in the Synoptic Gospels. It gets developed into something theological in the Gospel of John. And as we're seeing from things like this, built into the community of believers. They understand Jesus and the Father are one.
Well, I think there's something also to be said about the fact that the statement that we have here is to commemorate who did it, and that it was as a memorial, right? And particularly, she is credited for the table. So the Roman centurion is the one who commissioned and paid for the mosaic. She's the one who commissioned this table, and so, as you were saying, Wes, most likely this table was a communion, table. That this would have been a remembrance of who Christ was, what he accomplished, right? His life, death, and resurrection. That he is, that it was through his body being broken and his blood being shed, that we are free. So it's kind of.
That's a good point, because they're saying that in what other society or culture or religion do a man become God, especially from a historical person? Hardly any. I can't really think of like a man becoming God. Yes, there's like the Greek gods, but those are already gods coming down and then there's half demigods, but those aren't not based off of a historical person. Jesus is the only one. Not like based off of a historical person, though. I don't see that. Becoming deities, I don't think are the same thing. Like all of the major religions, I don't think they're not comparing them to the same thing.
Brings back this idea of, well, what's different than from Jesus and all these other would-be messiahs?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, our friend Glenn Scrivener, friend of the ministry, who spoke at our Ontario conference, one of the things he says that I really like is that one of the best evidences for Jesus' resurrection is that we're still talking about it.
Absolutely.
Right? In that, you have other individuals. When we were talking earlier, I mentioned Simon Bar-Giora. Like, how many people who are listening right now know who Simon Bar-Giora is? He was a messianic figure in the first century. And when he died, so did his movement. And there are multiple other examples. Simon Bar Kokhba, they aren't just all mentioned named Simon, but there are individuals within the ancient world who claim to be messianic figures who started things like revolutions, which is what they were expecting the Messiah to be, and they died, and so did their movement, so did their followers, and yet, what do we see in the New Testament?
It's a good point about, when you look to the early church and you look at what some of those writers were saying, what were the apologists of the early church saying about, why this is true? A lot of them were pointing to the fact that the church exists, right? That was the language they were using. They were pointing directly at the community of believers and saying, that's all the proof we need.
And I think we see this type of expectation within the disciples themselves. They're in the upper room. Judas has committed suicide. There's 11 of them. And even when Mary comes back and says, the Lord is risen, the tomb is empty, what does Thomas say? I'm not going to believe until I see it myself, until I put my fingers into his wounds. He's still like, no, I'm not going to get my hopes up. I can't do that. And so the fact that 11 scared disciples go from hiding, scared in an upper room, to then going out into the world and being willing to face the persecution of the Roman Empire, leading to Roman centurions commissioning floors that include descriptions as Jesus as God within only a couple hundred years. I mean, that's some pretty strong evidence. And then breaking these cultural expectations, Roman centurions and women. And this was a point of mockery. What is some of the earliest discussions of Christianity describe them as? The religions of slave women and children. Because these were groups that, we don't care about.
Now we see that as a badge of honor.
Right.
Absolutely.
Back then it was seen like this, what a joke.
And ironically, some of the accusations against Christianity today are, well, they don't treat women right. Right? When if you look at history, the accusations were they treat women right to begin with.
Wow. I just think there's just so much proof for Christianity more than any other religion out there, guys. Like, so if you're having like doubts or being a skeptic, I get it. It's okay. It's important to be a skeptic and think, but you can't constantly be a skeptic about everything. That's such a good point. Chapter 13, verse 23 says, "And it is one of King David's descendants, Jesus, who is God's promised Savior of Israel." From Scripture, they believe that Jesus is God. From the beginning of time, they believe that Jesus is God. So go to Jesus today. Know that he loves you. He's longing to have a relationship with you.